At the end of November 2017, a moment of historic weight slipped quietly beneath the surface of global news. While the world was looking elsewhere, the so-called Islamic State, the militant organization that had terrified millions and dominated international conversations, lost the final scraps of territory it once ruled with absolute brutality. Only a short time earlier, this group controlled a vast piece of land stretching across Syria and Iraq, an area comparable in size to the entire United Kingdom. The speed of its rise, and the speed of its collapse, left many people wondering, how could a non-state actor grow so powerful so quickly, and how did the world eventually manage to dismantle the caliphate it claimed to have resurrected? To answer these questions, we must pull the camera back and look at the fault lines that shaped the region long before the first black flag appeared on the horizon. Syria and Iraq sit in a region where history has layered identities, rivalries, and traumas one on top of another. To the south and west stands Saudi Arabia, the center of the Sunni Arab world. To the east rises Iran, a predominantly Shiite, Persian-speaking nation with ambitions of regional influence. For decades, the rivalry between these two powers has shaped the political landscape of the Middle East. Caught between them lie states whose internal balances are delicate. Iraq, for instance, was ruled from 1979 by Saddam Hussein, a Sunni governing a population that was majority Shiite. Syria, meanwhile, came under the rule of Bashar al-Assad in 2000, when he inherited power from his father. Assad belongs to the Alawite community, a small minority making up roughly 13% of the country, yet it maintained control over key institutions and the military. Both nations also contain large Kurdish populations, part of a wider Kurdish nation of around 35 million people spread across several states and long denied a country of their own. Beneath these demographic tensions lie vast natural resources. Iraq possessed some of the largest known oil reserves on Earth, divided into 7 major deposits. 2 of them were still beginning to be developed at the dawn of the 21st century. In 1972, Saddam Hussein nationalized Iraqi oil, barring foreign companies from extracting it. Controlling oil meant controlling wealth, and controlling wealth meant holding power. Everything changed in 2003 when the United States, under the banner of fighting terrorism and eliminating weapons of mass destruction, launched an invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein in just 3 weeks. The speed of the victory disguised the depths of the chaos that would follow. After the regime collapsed, the Coalition Provisional Authority dissolved the Ba'ath Party, which had roughly 1.5 million members, and fired 200,000 public employees. Even more destabilizing, it dismantled the entire Iraqi army, sending more than 250,000 trained soldiers, mostly Sunnis, home without salaries, without futures, and with a profound sense of betrayal. Many of these men were skilled fighters. Suddenly they had nothing to defend except their anger. This created a massive vacuum. State institutions crumbled. Local authorities lost legitimacy. Into this space stepped militias, insurgents, and extremists eager to fill the void. By 2004, a Sunni extremist faction in Iraq pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden and became known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Led initially by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the group waged war not only against American forces but also against Iraqi Shiites, fueling a sectarian conflict that turned entire neighborhoods into battlefields. As the civil war intensified, Al-Qaeda in Iraq merged with several other militant factions and eventually rebranded itself as the Islamic State of Iraq. The seeds of future catastrophe had been planted. In June 2009, the Iraqi government auctioned several of its major oil fields to multinational corporations. At the same time, American forces began withdrawing from the country. The worst of the civil war seemed to fade, but the structural fractures remained. Meanwhile, across the Middle East, anger, frustration, and hope converged during the Arab Spring of 2011. Ordinary people rose against authoritarian regimes. In Tunisia and Egypt, long-standing leaders fell. In Libya, civil war began. And in Syria, protests erupted against Bashar al-Assad. The regime responded with force, arresting demonstrators, firing on crowds, and eventually besieging entire cities. Parts of the Syrian army defected and formed the Free Syrian Army. Foreign governments quietly supplied weapons and funding. Assad, unwilling to lose power, leaned heavily on Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, both determined to preserve their strategic ally. As the conflict deepened, the battlefield grew more crowded. Extremist groups flowed into Syria, attracted by chaos and by the opportunity to carve out territory. One of these groups was the al-Nusra Front, al-Qaeda's official branch in Syria. Its ranks grew rapidly, fueled by foreign fighters and radical networks. In 2013, the Islamic State of Iraq announced that it was expanding into Syria and absorbing al-Nusra into a new organization, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant ISIL. Al-Qaeda rejected this move, creating a major split in the global jihadist movement. ISIL, defiant, struck out on its own. Within months, it launched offensive campaigns across northern Syria, capturing towns and villages. In June 2013, it seized most of Raqqa. The city soon became its political capital, a place where captured fighters were executed in public squares and where its propaganda machine pumped out videos designed to terrify the world. Meanwhile, Syrian Kurds in the north united and declared autonomous self-administration. They formed the YPG and the YPJ armed defense units that would become some of the most effective ground forces against the Islamic State. As the war raged in Syria, Iraq once again began to destabilize. Protests and uprisings erupted in Sunni-majority regions such as Al-Anbar. The Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant saw an opening. It launched a major offensive, capturing weapons, vehicles, and even tanks abandoned by Iraqi soldiers who fled in panic. In June 2014, ISIL captured Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, home to nearly 2 million people. The scale of the collapse shocked the world. Entire divisions of the Iraqi army dissolved. Black flags flew over government buildings. Billions of dollars worth of equipment fell into militant hands. From Mosul, the group pushed outward, seizing more towns and approaching the vital oil-rich region of Kirkuk. But here, the Kurdish Peshmerga experienced, disciplined fighters halted their advance. ISIL, now calling itself simply the Islamic State, declared itself a caliphate. Its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, delivered a sermon from Mosul's Great Mosque, presenting himself as the caliph of all Muslims. It was a direct challenge not only to regional governments but also to al-Qaeda, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the entire international order. Iran reacted swiftly, sending troops, artillery, and military advisors to support Iraq. The United States formed a new coalition of 69 nations. Airstrikes began targeting IS convoys, training camps, and oil facilities, the lifeblood of the caliphate's economy. Oil smuggling brought the Islamic State tens of millions of dollars monthly, flowing through networks of brokers, truckers, and corrupt border guards. Meanwhile, jihadist groups across Africa and Asia began pledging allegiance to the Islamic State. From Libya to Nigeria to the Philippines, militants adopted its flag, hoping to share in its momentum. But on the ground in Syria, the Islamic State met unexpected resistance. In the northern city of Kobane, IS fighters pushed Kurdish forces to the brink of collapse. The world watched as black flags approached the border with Turkey. Then, in a dramatic reversal, Kurdish fighters aided by relentless coalition airstrikes pushed the Islamic State out of the city. It was the group's first major defeat. Victories followed. The Kurds captured Tel Abyad, cutting off a crucial border crossing used for smuggling oil, weapons, and foreign fighters. Each loss weakened the caliphate's finances and slowed its expansion. In September 2015, Russia entered the war directly. Moscow launched airstrikes in support of Assad, determined to preserve its strategic foothold and its only naval base in the Mediterranean, located at Tartus. Russian jets targeted numerous rebel groups, especially those near major Syrian cities. Meanwhile, the Kurds continued to expand their alliance with Arab and Christian militias, forming the Syrian Democratic Forces. Their goal was not only to fight the Islamic State but also to secure autonomy in northern Syria. This alarmed Turkey, which feared the creation of a Kurdish-controlled corridor along its entire southern border. After repairing relations with Russia, Turkey launched Operation Euphrates Shield, capturing key towns and pushing IS forces away from the border, while also preventing Kurdish forces from connecting their territories. In Iraq, the Peshmerga and the Iraqi army advanced on Mosul from opposite directions. Battles raged street by street for months. In early 2017, Mosul fell. The Islamic State lost its largest city and its symbolic capital. Shortly after, the Syrian Democratic Forces advanced into Raqqa. Block by block, building by building, they dismantled the administrative heart of the caliphate. By late 2017, Raqqa was liberated and the Islamic State's territorial project was effectively over. But victory carried new complications. In the power vacuum left by IS, Iraqi Kurds held a referendum on independence. Tensions rose sharply. The Iraqi government launched operations to retake disputed areas, including vital oil fields and border crossings. After several weeks of clashes, a ceasefire was reached. Syria, meanwhile, remained fragmented. Assad clung to power. Rebels held isolated pockets. Kurdish forces maintained de facto autonomy. Russia and Iran emerged geopolitically strengthened. Saudi Arabia became increasingly drawn into the conflict in Yemen, battling the Houthi movement backed by Iran. Today, the Islamic State no longer controls territory in the Middle East, yet its impact lingers everywhere. In Iraq, a fragile peace survives, but rebuilding trust between Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds will take generations. Syria remains shattered, bearing the scars of a war that killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. Regional rivalries have intensified. And although the physical caliphate has vanished, the ideological movement behind it continues to inspire attacks across the world. The story of the Islamic State is not just the story of a terrorist organization. It is the story of broken states, foreign interventions, historic rivalries, and the power vacuum created when governance collapses. It is a lesson about how quickly instability can spread and how long it takes to rebuild once darkness takes root. And while the black flags have been lowered, the geopolitical struggles that allowed them to rise are far from over. Those battles continue today, shaping the future of the Middle East and beyond. Yet the end of the territorial caliphate did not mark the end of the forces that had given rise to it. In many ways, the collapse of the Islamic State revealed deeper structural fractures across the Middle East, fractures that had existed long before the black banners appeared, and that would continue shaping events long after the last square kilometer of land was recaptured. The organization may have lost its cities, its oil fields, and its formal hierarchy, but the grievances and rivalries that had fueled its ascent remained unresolved. Understanding the post-caliphate landscape requires looking at how the region transformed once the common enemy retreated into the desert. In Iraq, the aftermath of the war exposed a country exhausted by 4 decades of conflict, sanctions, occupation, civil war, and insurgency. Entire provinces lay in ruins. Cities like Mosul and Fallujah had been reduced to landscapes of shattered concrete and twisted steel. Rebuilding these areas required billions of dollars, money the Iraqi government did not have. Foreign aid trickled in slowly, constrained by donor fatigue and political mistrust. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of families displaced by fighting were unable to return home, either because their neighborhoods were destroyed or because returning to areas dominated by different sectarian groups felt unsafe. The Iraqi state faced an immense challenge: how to rebuild trust between communities that had spent years viewing each other through the lens of fear. Even after victory, suspicion lingered. Sunni tribes feared retaliation, Shiite militias demanded recognition for their sacrifices, and Kurdish leaders sought guarantees of autonomy. The fragile peace that emerged relied more on exhaustion than reconciliation. Complicating this landscape was the powerful network of Shiite militias known collectively as the Popular Mobilization Forces. These groups had played a decisive role in defeating the Islamic State, but their growing political influence raised alarms both inside Iraq and abroad. Some factions maintained close ties to Iran, receiving weapons, training, and funding. Others pursued their own agendas, controlling checkpoints, levying unofficial taxes, and competing for influence in Baghdad. The central government struggled to integrate these militias into the national armed forces without provoking new conflicts. For many Iraqis, the question was unsettling: had the country escaped one form of extremism only to risk falling under the shadow of another? In Syria, the situation was even more dire. The Islamic State's defeat removed one major actor from the battlefield, but the war itself was far from over. Bashar al-Assad's forces, backed by Russia and Iran, regained control over key regions, yet vast areas of the northeast remained under the authority of the Syrian Democratic Forces. These Kurdish-led administrations built their own institutions, police forces, and education systems. Their experiment in self-governance challenged the very concept of a centralized Syrian state. Turkey, alarmed by any Kurdish empowerment, launched multiple military operations to carve out buffer zones along its border. Civilians were forced to flee repeatedly, turning northern Syria into an ever-shifting mosaic of control. At the same time, pockets of rebel forces backed by Turkey, remnants of jihadist factions, and local tribal groups operated in the Idlib region. Russian and Syrian government airstrikes regularly targeted the area, while Turkey deployed troops to prevent total collapse. The result was a tense and fragile stalemate, a front line where millions of civilians lived in uncertainty, dependent on humanitarian aid and vulnerable to sudden escalations. Beyond the immediate conflict zones, the geopolitical consequences of the Islamic State era reshaped alliances across the Middle East. Iran emerged as one of the major beneficiaries. Through military support in Iraq and Syria, Tehran expanded its network of influence, securing land routes and political partnerships stretching from Iran through Iraq and Syria to Lebanon, a corridor often referred to as the Shiite Crescent. For Iran, this was not merely a military accomplishment but a strategic realignment that increased its leverage in regional negotiations. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, faced increasing challenges to its long-standing role as the dominant Sunni power. As Iran's influence grew, Riyadh doubled down on its intervention in Yemen, portraying the conflict as a necessary barrier against Iranian expansion. Yet the war dragged on far longer than expected, draining resources and drawing international criticism over humanitarian consequences. The rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, one of the core drivers behind regional instability, became even more entrenched in the years following the Islamic State's fall. Meanwhile, the United States re-evaluated its involvement. After years of counter-terrorism operations, Washington shifted its focus toward containing Iran and managing its regional commitments. Successive American administrations debated how deeply the country should remain entangled in Middle Eastern affairs. While the U.S. maintained military bases and conducted targeted operations, its long-term strategy grew increasingly ambiguous. This ambiguity created openings for Russia, which stepped into the diplomatic vacuum with surprising agility. By mediating between Turkey, Iran, and the Syrian government, Moscow positioned itself as an indispensable power broker in a region where American influence once seemed unshakable. Yet despite the shifting alliances, the central threat that had allowed the Islamic State to rise, state failure, remained present. In both Syria and Iraq, millions of young people grew up amid war, displacement, and economic collapse. Many lacked access to stable education, employment, or political representation. In such circumstances, extremist ideologies found fertile ground. Intelligence agencies warned that while the caliphate was dismantled territorially, the organization had evolved into a decentralized insurgency. Its fighters retreated into deserts, mountains, and rural areas, launching ambushes, assassinations, and hit-and-run attacks. The black flag no longer flew over cities, but the ideology survived in encrypted channels, underground cells, and isolated communities scarred by years of violence. The question haunting policymakers was simple: what prevents another group from rising? The answer was far more complex. The collapse of the Islamic State did not erase sectarian divides, political corruption, or economic hardships. Instead, it magnified them. In many areas, people still lacked access to dependable public services. Entire districts remained under the informal governance of militias. Reconstruction efforts lagged behind population needs. Without meaningful reforms, the structural roots of radicalization persisted. At the same time, the fight against the Islamic State changed the nature of warfare itself. Drones, cyber operations, intelligence algorithms, and precision strikes became central tools in counterterrorism. These technological shifts reshaped military doctrine worldwide and raised new ethical questions about surveillance, autonomy, and the use of force. The caliphate may have vanished, but its legacy continued to redefine how nations fought, cooperated, and protected their borders. Looking beyond the battlefield, the collapse of the Islamic State also set off a cultural and psychological reckoning. Hundreds of foreign fighters were detained in improvised prisons across Syria. Thousands of women and children connected to the group were housed in sprawling camps like Al-Hol, where radical ideology continued to circulate. Governments around the world hesitated to repatriate their citizens, fearing legal complications and security risks. This created a new humanitarian crisis, one that risked becoming the breeding ground for the next generation of extremism. Meanwhile, regional populations tried to move forward. In cities once governed by fear, life slowly returned, markets reopened, schools resumed classes, festivals were held again. But beneath the surface, trauma lingered. Families searched for missing relatives, communities debated how to reintegrate former militants, courts struggled with the sheer volume of war-related crimes. Post-war justice became a patchwork of tribal agreements, militia-run tribunals, and international investigations, each with its own standards and limitations. As the years passed, analysts recognized a profound reality: the fall of the Islamic State was not an ending but a transition. The Middle East entered a new era, one defined not by clear territorial battles but by political negotiations, proxy conflicts, economic struggles, and fragile ceasefires. The Caliphate had tested the resilience of the region, revealing its vulnerabilities and accelerating its transformations. And yet, despite everything, the story remains unfinished. The forces that shaped the Islamic State's rise, sectarian divides, failed governance, foreign interventions, demographic pressures, and regional rivalries, continue to shape the Middle East today. Whether the region moves toward stability or plunges into a new cycle of conflict will depend on decisions made in Baghdad, Damascus, Ankara, Tehran, Riyadh, Washington, and Moscow. The Caliphate is gone, but the questions it raised about identity, power, justice, and the future of the region still echo across deserts, river valleys, and ruined cities. The world may have turned its attention elsewhere, but the shadow of the Islamic State lingers, a reminder of how quickly the geopolitical landscape can shift when the foundations beneath it begin to fracture.